Welcome back, my friend. The lamps are lit, the wind has quieted, and somewhere in the shadows the Niffler has found something shiny again. But this time, it's not gold. It's a story, and tonight, he's ready to share it with you. So settle in and listen closely. It begins like this.
The May morning promised to be particularly warm. The sun was already rising above the towers of Hogwarts, dispersing the last ghostly shadows of night, whilst the air carried the scent of fresh grass and blooming chestnuts. Birds chirped merrily in the treetops, and a gentle breeze brought with it the aromas of the awakening spring forest. Such a morning would usually fill Rubeus Hagrid's heart with joy and inspiration for his work with beloved magical creatures. But this time he awoke to an unusual sensation, a cold that ran across his enormous shoulders, as though someone had thrown open every window of his hut in the depths of the harshest winter. It was so peculiar on such a warm day that Hagrid first thought he had dreamed of blizzards and icy winds. "What the devil?" he muttered, stretching and trying to understand where this strange chill had come from on such a beautiful May morning. Fong lifted his head from his favorite spot by the fireplace, where embers still glowed from the previous evening, and whined softly, looking towards the door with inexplicable anxiety. His usually cheerful tail wasn't wagging as it did each morning. Instead, the large dog looked troubled, even slightly frightened. His ears were alert, and in his brown eyes glowed some primordial wariness, as though he sensed something that human senses could not perceive. Hagrid rose from his massive bed, the floorboards creaking under his weight, and approached the small window with its multicolored panes. The previous night had indeed been extraordinarily strange. Sudden lightning without thunder had danced across the dark sky, as though some invisible being was playing with magical fires. At first he had thought it an ordinary spring storm, but the lightning had been too bright, too multicolored, and most importantly, it had appeared without a single sound, which was extremely unusual for any natural phenomenon. The lightning had possessed strange hues, blue, silver, sometimes almost white, and each left a barely visible trail in the air, like sparks from enchanted wands. Hagrid had even considered going out to observe this unusual phenomenon more closely, but in the end had decided it was some experiment from the Ministry of Magic, perhaps something connected with weather charms or new forms of magical transport. He had seen enough strange things in his long life to know. Sometimes it was better not to meddle in affairs that didn't directly concern him. But now, as the gentle morning sun illuminated his small but cozy garden with its enormous pumpkins and various magical plants, Hagrid saw something entirely unusual and alarming. By his door, curled into a tight ball amongst the morning flowers, lay a creature that at first glance resembled a large lizard or an unusual cat. Its smooth skin was of a blue-silver color and gleamed in the sunlight, as though made from the purest ice or the most precious crystal. "Good Lord," whispered Hagrid, feeling his great heart leap with anxiety and compassion. He hastily threw on his large woolen coat, thrust his feet into high leather boots, and rushed outside, almost forgetting to close the door behind him. Fong took a few uncertain steps after him, but then stopped at the threshold, whining and clearly unwilling to approach the mysterious creature. The cold became noticeable immediately, as soon as Hagrid approached the being within a few paces. The air around the mystical creature trembled with low temperature, and on the fresh green grass surrounding it could be seen tiny crystals of frost that sparkled in the morning sun like scattered diamonds. The temperature dropped with each step, and Hagrid felt his breath begin to form white clouds of vapor, though a minute earlier, near his hut, it had been quite warm. The creature lay motionless amongst the flowers, and Hagrid feared with growing dread that it might be dead. He had seen many magical creatures in his life, from tiny Cornish pixies to enormous dragons, but had never encountered anything that could so dramatically affect the temperature of its surroundings simply by its presence. "Here, little one," he murmured gently, carefully extending his large, calloused hand. "What's happened to you? How did you come to be here by my home?" The moment his fingertips touched the creature's gleaming skin, he instantly jerked his hand back with a painful cry and shook it, trying to rid himself of the sensation of piercing cold. The being was cold as a chunk of ice that had lain all through the harshest winter in the deepest storage. The cold was so intense and penetrating that Hagrid felt his fingers begin to numb even after such brief contact, whilst the pain of frostbite began to spread across his palm. But contrary to his expectations and fears, the creature stirred at his touch, weakly raising its elegant head. Its eyes were extraordinary, pale blue, like a winter sky before dawn when the last stars still glimmer in the pre-morning mist. In those eyes glowed some deep exhaustion, fear, and at the same time some strange, almost human hope. The creature looked at Hagrid, and he felt his heart constrict with sincere compassion and determination to help. Whatever this was, it was clearly suffering and needed urgent assistance. "You're alive, little one," whispered Hagrid with enormous relief, not daring to touch again but speaking as gently as possible. "But what's happened to you? How did you get here? And why are you so terribly cold?" The creature tried to raise its head higher, but clearly lacked the strength. It whined softly. The sound was like a thin crystal bell trembling in a frosty northern wind. The sound was both beautiful and sad, filled with some profound longing. The air around it became even colder, and Hagrid noticed how his own breathing began to form ever larger and denser white clouds of vapor. "You look very weak," muttered Hagrid, pondering what to do next. "Perhaps you're hungry and frozen. I need to take you inside, to the warmth by the fire. You'll be much better and cozier there." He gathered his courage and, despite the piercing cold, carefully lifted the creature. It was lighter than he had expected, about the size of a large cat or small dog, but its body was strangely dense, as though made of pure, living crystal. The cold from it penetrated Hagrid to his very bones, even through his thick clothing, but he gritted his teeth with determination and carried the being to his cozy hut, where a warm fire burned and a homely atmosphere reigned. Fong immediately fled and hid behind the large oak dining table, whining and watching the stranger with obvious mistrust and instinctive fear. The large dog had never been cowardly and had always greeted new magical creatures that Hagrid occasionally brought home with curiosity, but something about this being made his deepest instincts scream of potential danger. "Don't worry, Fong," Hagrid reassured him, trying to speak as confidently and calmly as possible. "This is just a poor, sick creature that needs our help and care. You know we never leave anyone in trouble, especially when someone needs our protection." He carefully placed the being on his softest woolen blanket by the fireplace, where logs crackled merrily and warm orange flames danced. Hagrid hurried to add more wood so the fire would burn brighter and warmer. The wood flared with new vigor, filling the hut with even greater warmth, bright light, and the cozy crackling that always created an atmosphere of safety and comfort. But instead of the expected improvement, the creature began to look even worse. It started trembling more violently, its blue-silver scales darkened, losing their magical gleam and beauty, whilst the whites of its eyes began to show beneath the lids. Its breathing became shallow and irregular. "Perhaps it needs even more warmth," reasoned Hagrid, growing increasingly worried about the being's condition. "Maybe you're just terribly chilled?" He hastily grabbed his thickest woolen blanket, the very one Professor McGonagall had given him for his birthday, and carefully covered the creature with it, hoping the additional warmth would help it recover. But the effect was horrifically opposite to what he had expected. The creature began to gasp, its breathing becoming shallow and choppy, as though it were drowning in an invisible sea or trying to breathe in an airless void. The air around it grew even colder, despite the proximity of the hot fireplace, and Hagrid watched with horror and amazement as ice crystals began to form on the blanket, spreading rapidly across the entire fabric like some magical freezing spell. "No, no, no," he muttered anxiously, quickly removing the blanket and tossing it aside. "Something's not right here. This isn't helping. What am I doing wrong?" The creature now lay even weaker, its breathing barely perceptible, whilst its body seemed almost lifeless. The blue-silver scales had lost nearly all their luster, and its eyes were closed from exhaustion. Hagrid felt absolutely helpless and confused. Usually he had a natural instinct with magical creatures. He intuitively understood what they needed, how to calm them, feed them, heal them, or simply make them happier. But this being was a complete mystery, and all his usual, time-tested methods only worsened the situation. "Perhaps you're hungry?" He tried another idea. "Hot tea with honey always helps when someone feels poorly." He hurriedly put his old copper kettle on the fire and began nervously bustling about his small kitchen, occasionally glancing anxiously at the creature. It lay very still and motionless, and only the barely perceptible rise and fall of its sides indicated it was still alive. Each time its breathing became weaker or more irregular, Hagrid's heart clenched with fear and despair. Never in his life had he felt so helpless in the face of a living being's suffering. Even when little Norbert had been ill with dragon pox, or when Aragog had been injured in a scuffle with other forest dwellers, Hagrid had always known what to do. But this creature challenged everything he knew and understood about caring for magical beings. When the tea finally boiled, filling the hut with the aroma of mint and honey, Hagrid carefully poured the warm, fragrant liquid into his smallest ceramic bowl and brought it to the creature's narrow muzzle. It sniffed weakly but immediately turned away, and Hagrid watched with growing amazement and alarm as the tea began to rapidly cover with a thin skin of ice where the warm steam approached the being. "What manner of wonder is this?" he whispered, staring at this incredible and incomprehensible phenomenon. "You freeze everything around you. But what sort of creature are you, so very unusual?" The water in the bowl continued to freeze, forming strange, beautiful patterns on the surface, whilst the air around the being trembled with cold, despite the heat from the fireplace. Hagrid had never seen anything like it, and hadn't the faintest idea what to do next. It was at this most desperate moment that someone knocked at his hut door, 3 confident but polite knocks. Hagrid quickly covered the creature with light fabric, not for warmth, for he had begun to suspect this was harmful, but simply to hide it from strangers' eyes until he could understand what was happening. He approached the door and opened it, trying to appear as calm as possible, though his heart was pounding with excitement and fear for the mysterious guest's life. On the threshold stood 3 students whom he had seen before in the school corridors, but didn't know well. First was a tall, slender girl from Ravenclaw with intelligent, inquisitive brown eyes and a magnificent mane of chestnut hair that fell to her shoulders in soft waves. On her neat robes gleamed the Silver House emblem, and in her hands she held several books. Even so early in the morning, she looked as though she had just emerged from the library or was preparing to go there. The second student was a pleasant boy from Hufflepuff with a kind, open smile and tousled red hair that stuck up cheerfully in all directions, giving him a somewhat untidy but sympathetic appearance. His yellow robes were slightly wrinkled, and on his sleeves could be seen fresh traces of earth. Apparently, he had already managed to work in the morning greenhouses, or with Professor Sprout in the magical plant garden. The third student was an older girl from Gryffindor with a determined, energetic gaze and short dark curls that framed her expressive, characteristic face. She stood straight, head held high, and in her bright green eyes shone natural resolve and readiness for action, characteristic of the best representatives of her house. "Good morning, Hagrid," said the Ravenclaw girl, bowing slightly with the politeness characteristic of her house. "Forgive us for disturbing you so early in the morning. I'm Emma Frostborn from 5th year, and these are my friends, Theodore Greenfield from 4th year Hufflepuff and Selena Moonlight from 6th year Gryffindor. We saw a very strange, unusual glow near your hut last evening," added Theodore, his voice sounding genuinely concerned and interested. "During those mysterious lightning flashes without thunder. At first we thought it might be some experiment from the professors, but then we saw that this morning there's real frost around your house," finished Selena, pointing to the white crystals on the grass surrounding the hut. "But it's May and so warm. We're genuinely worried. Is everything all right? Has something bad happened? Do you need any help?" Hagrid hesitated, torn between different feelings and considerations. He had always valued students' concern, especially those who showed genuine interest in magical creatures and weren't afraid of the unusual. But he also didn't want to create unnecessary commotion at the school or expose anyone to unknown danger. On the other hand, the mysterious creature inside his hut might die whilst he tried to handle the problem alone, having no idea what to do next. Well, he began uncertainly, trying to gather his thoughts and make the right decision, but at this most critical moment a faint, almost imperceptible sound came from behind him, like crystalline weeping or the melodious chiming of thin ice bells in a northern wind. The students immediately stopped smiling and exchanged glances with obvious alarm and growing concern. "Hagrid," said Selena softly but firmly, taking a step forward and looking directly into his eyes, "it seems someone inside your hut needs help, and probably urgently. That sounds like something living that's suffering," added Emma, her voice trembling with compassion. "We can help. We really can." The large, kind man looked at their sincere faces full of compassion and realized he could no longer hide this, especially if the being was truly dying before his eyes. Moreover, perhaps fresh perspectives from young minds and new ideas were exactly what was needed in this seemingly hopeless situation. "All right," he said finally, stepping back from the threshold and inviting them in. "Come in, but I warn you straight away, this is something completely unusual and mysterious. I don't understand what's happening myself, and please be very careful. And I ask you, not a word to anyone about what you see until we work out what this is and how to help it." The three students nodded seriously, showing they understood the importance of the situation, and entered the cozy but now strangely cold hut. Immediately they felt the unusual, piercing cold that sharply contrasted with the warm May weather outside and the heat from the fireplace. Fong still hid behind the large oak table, occasionally carefully poking his nose out and sniffing, his eyes expressing a complex mixture of fear, curiosity, and instinctive wariness. Here, Hagrid approached the creature bundled under the fabric and carefully uncovered it. "Look for yourselves, but don't touch, it's very cold." All three students gasped simultaneously with amazement and wonder. Emma pressed her hand to her chest, Theodore's eyes widened with astonishment, and Selena crouched beside the creature, looking at it with an expression of deep compassion on her face. "Oh my goodness," whispered Emma with reverence. "It's a magical creature, but it's so unusual. I've never seen anything even remotely similar." "It really is very cold," noted Theodore, carefully extending his hand, but immediately jerking it back from the intense cold, as though it's a living piece of winter or the embodiment of a northern wind. "And it's very ill and weak," added Selena sadly, her voice trembling with excitement. "Look how difficult and irregular its breathing is, and how weak its eyes look." Hagrid told them in detail about his entire morning adventure, how he had found the unusual creature by his door after the strange night of mysterious lightning, how he had tried to help it by warming it by the fireplace, covering it with a warm blanket, giving it hot tea with honey, and how each of these good intentions had only worsened the mysterious being's condition. The more thoroughly he recounted, the more the students frowned and pondered. "This is very strange," said Emma thoughtfully, twisting the end of her chestnut hair around her finger. Her usual habit when she was thinking deeply about a complex problem. "Everything looks as though heat harms it rather than helps." "Yes," agreed Theodore, "as if everything's the opposite of what seems logical. But what if that's truly the case?" Selena suddenly said, looking at the creature with new understanding. "What if it's not sick from cold, but on the contrary, suffering from heat?" The creature at that moment stirred weakly and whined softly. The sound was thin and sad, but there was some hope in it, as though it understood that these people were trying to help. "You know what?" said Emma decisively, rising to her feet. "I think we need to find out what sort of creature this is. I can go to the library and look for information about unusual magical beings. Meanwhile, I'll try to find a way to cool the air around it," added Theodore. "Perhaps bring some ice from the kitchen or ask the house elves to help." "And I'll stay here with Hagrid," said Selena, "and monitor the creature's condition. If it becomes critically ill, we'll need to act quickly." Hagrid looked at these young people with gratitude and hope. For the first time this anxious morning, he felt he wasn't alone with his helplessness before the mysterious creature. "That's a wonderful idea," he said, feeling optimism awakening in his heart. Thank you. Thank you truly for wanting to help." Emma was already moving towards the door, clutching her books tightly. "I know where the rarest guides to magical creatures are kept in the library. If anything's written about this being anywhere, I'll definitely find it." "And I'll rush to the kitchen," said Theodore, also hurrying towards the exit. House elves are always ready to help, especially when it's a matter of saving someone's life. When the two students ran from the hut, Selena sat closer to the creature, carefully extending her hand, but not touching it. "Don't worry," she said quietly, addressing both Hagrid and the being simultaneously. "We'll definitely think of something. Emma is very clever and well-read. If an answer exists, she'll find it. And Theodore has golden hands and always finds practical solutions to any problems." The creature weakly opened its eyes and looked at her. In its blue gaze appeared something resembling gratitude and trust. It whined softly. This time the sound was less desperate and more like quiet purring. "See," whispered Selena. "It understands we want to help. It's not giving up." Hagrid sat beside them on the floor, not taking his eyes off the mysterious guest. "I've never seen anything like it in all my life. And I've seen plenty, dragons, unicorns, hippogriffs, even acromantulas. But this is something quite special." "It's beautiful," said Selena quietly, observing how blue-silver hues shimmered on the creature's skin. "And so lonely, as though it's very far from home." The creature stirred again, tried to lift its head, but weakened once more. Its breathing became even shallower, whilst the cold aura around its body grew weaker. "Hold on, little one," whispered Hagrid, feeling fear clutch his heart again. "Hold on. Help is coming." Outside could be heard the sound of someone hurrying along the path. Quick, light footsteps of Theodore. The boy appeared in the doorway with a large bowl full of ice cubes, and several bottles containing something cold. The house elves were absolutely delighted at the chance to help, he said breathlessly. They gave me everything cold they had and said they're ready to bring more, as much as needed. He carefully placed the bowl of ice near the creature. The effect was almost instantaneous and striking. The being took a deep breath, its eyes became brighter, and the blue-silver scales on its skin gleamed again with healthy, beautiful light. "Look!" exclaimed Selena. "It immediately feels better." The creature slowly raised its head and carefully sniffed the ice. Then it barely touched one cube with its thin tongue and purred quietly with satisfaction. "It's eating ice," whispered Hagrid with amazement. "Eating it like we eat bread." "So we were right," said Theodore joyfully. "It needs cold, not heat." The creature became more active, slowly moving around the ice chunks, leaving thin trails of frost on the floor behind it. It looked no longer so sick and weak, but rather simply tired after difficult trials. "Now the main thing is to wait for Emma," said Selena. "When we find out what sort of creature this is, we'll be able to understand better how to care for it." Fong, seeing that the mysterious being had become less dangerous and no longer radiated such intense cold, carefully emerged from behind the table and sat beside Hagrid, observing the unusual guest from a safe distance. "Even Fong has calmed down," smiled Hagrid. "That's a good sign." Outside could be heard footsteps again, this time slower, heavier. Emma was returning from the library, and from the sounds it was clear she was carrying many books. The creature raised its head, listening to the sounds, then looked at its rescuers with its beautiful blue eyes, in which now shone not fear and despair, but gratitude and hope. It sang softly, a melodious sound like crystalline ice bells dancing in a winter wind. "It's singing," whispered Selena, enchanted by the beautiful sound. "It's thanking us." Hagrid felt his eyes fill with tears of emotion. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing. This mysterious, beautiful creature had found in his hut not only salvation, but people ready to fight for its life and happiness. The strange, cold morning promised to be the beginning of a real adventure. Emma returned from the library beneath the weight of a veritable mountain of books of various sizes and ages. Some were so ancient that their leather bindings had cracked with age and become covered with the patina of centuries, whilst others appeared recently published with crisp golden lettering on their covers. Several particularly valuable volumes bore restricted access, seals, and magical locks that glimmered with blue light. "Madame Pants didn't want to give me some of these books at first," she recounted breathlessly, carefully lowering her treasure onto the floor by the fireplace. "But when I told her it was a matter of life and death for a magical creature, she not only allowed me to take everything necessary, but also helped me find the rarest editions herself." Hagrid and the students gazed with fascination at this library scattered across the floor of the hut. The creature, which now felt considerably better thanks to the ice, raised its head and looked with interest at the new objects that had appeared in its temporary refuge. "This is an incredible collection," said Theodore with respect, examining the titles. "Magical creatures of the northern seas, rare species of polar fauna, secrets of Antarctic magic." "Emma, how did you find all this so quickly?" "I memorized the layout of all the sections in my second year," smiled the girl, opening the first volume. "And when you see a creature that can freeze everything around itself, it immediately becomes clear which direction to search in." She began rapidly turning the pages of the first book, her fingers gliding familiarly over the old parchment. "Here, various types of magical lizards and amphibians that live in cold climates are described. Look, Icelandic ice geckos, Norwegian snow newts, Greenlandic frost iguanas. But none of these creatures resemble ours," noted Selena, comparing the illustrations with the being that lay by the ice. "Yes, they're either too small or have completely different body structure," agreed Hagrid. "And our guest has very particular proportions, and that unusual blue-silver coloring." Emma moved to the next volume, a thick book in a dark blue binding with silver runes. "And this is Polar Magical Creatures and Their Characteristics by Professor Arcturus Fingold, one of the most authoritative works in this field." She carefully turned several yellowed pages until she found the right section. "Here, rare species of salamanders. Ordinary fire salamanders are described here. Then, oh!" Emma suddenly froze, reading the text intently. Her eyes widened with amazement and excitement. "What's there?" asked Theodore impatiently. "I think I've found it," whispered Emma, her voice trembling with excitement. "Listen. Frost salamander, or ice salamander, an extraordinarily rare magical creature that inhabits exclusively the coldest regions of Antarctica and Arctic islands. Approximately the size of a domestic cat, it has smooth blue-silver skin that gleams in light like ice crystals. "That's definitely it," exclaimed Hagrid, looking at the creature with new understanding. "Every detail matches." Emma continued reading, her voice gaining ever greater confidence. "The body temperature of these unique creatures constantly remains between -10 and -5 degrees Celsius. Their breath is capable of freezing water and other liquids at distances up to 2 meters, whilst the aura of cold around them can lower the temperature within a radius of 5 meters by 10 to 15 degrees. That's why the hut became so cold," realized Selena, "and why the tea froze when Hagrid tried to give it a drink." "Continue reading," requested Theodore, moving closer to hear better. "Unlike their fiery relatives, ordinary salamanders, frost salamanders require constantly low temperatures to survive," Emma read on. "At temperatures above 0 degrees Celsius, they begin to weaken, and at temperatures above 10 degrees, they may die within hours from heat stroke." "Good Lord," whispered Hagrid, feeling cold sweat break out on his forehead. "I could have killed it with my attempts to warm it." "But you didn't know," said Selena soothingly. "You acted with the best intentions." The creature, as though understanding it was being discussed, raised its head and looked at Hagrid with its blue eyes. There was no offense in its gaze, only understanding and gratitude. "What else is written there about food and care?" asked Theodore practically. Emma turned the page. "The basic diet of frost salamanders consists of ice, snow, and frozen water, which they absorb both through their mouths and through their skin. They also consume frozen berries, fruits, and small fish, but ice remains the primary source of both nourishment and energy. So we need to constantly provide it with ice," summarized Hagrid. "It's difficult, but possible." "But how did it get here?" wondered Selena. "Antarctica is thousands of kilometers away." Emma delved into the text again. "Frost salamanders never voluntarily leave their natural territories. They are incapable of long journeys in warm climates, and can survive outside polar regions only under artificially created conditions. In the magical world, only isolated cases of keeping them in captivity are known, since creating appropriate conditions is extraordinarily complex and expensive." "So someone brought it here," concluded Theodore. "But who and why? And most importantly, how did it escape or end up by my hut?" added Hagrid. Emma continued reading. "Due to their extraordinary rarity and unique properties, frost salamanders have become objects of illegal hunting and trade. Their ability to freeze objects is used in some dark rituals, whilst their blood and scales are considered valuable ingredients for powerful potions of cold and preservation." Hagrid's face darkened with anger. "Trading in living creatures. It's one of the most despicable things imaginable." "Perhaps it escaped from some collector or trader," suggested Selena. "And those lightning flashes last evening might have been connected with its escape." The creature suddenly raised its head higher and whined softly, as though confirming their suppositions. Then it slowly approached the largest chunk of ice and began licking it slowly, making quiet sounds of satisfaction. "Look how it eats," whispered Theodore with enchantment, as though savoring the most delicious delicacy. "And what's written there about their special abilities?" asked Selena. "You mentioned something about freezing breath." Emma found the relevant paragraph. "The most impressive feature of frost salamanders is their ability to emit streams of supercooled air from their mouths. The temperature of this breath can reach -40 degrees Celsius, allowing them to instantly freeze water, thin metal, and organic materials at distances up to 3 meters. "-40, marveled Hagrid. "That's incredible power." "This ability is used by them both for protection from predators and for hunting small Arctic animals," continued Emma. "Young individuals usually control their strength poorly and may accidentally freeze objects around them during stress or excitement." "A young individual," repeated Theodore. "So our guest is still a child?" "It seems so," nodded Hagrid. "That explains why it's so trusting and doesn't fear us very much." At that very moment the creature, as though sensing it had become the object of attention, raised its head and looked at them. Then it opened its small mouth and released a thin stream of cold air. The effect was instantaneous and impressive. The air in the path of the breath immediately became visible. A dense cloud of white vapor formed, whilst drops of water on Hagrid's table instantly covered with a thick layer of ice. The temperature in the room dropped by several more degrees. "Incredible!" exclaimed Theodore, observing this amazing phenomenon. "It's showing us its ability," whispered Selena with enchantment, "as though it wants to prove that it really is what we're reading about." The creature looked satisfied by the human's reaction. It released another stream of cold air, this time directing it at a bowl of water that stood on the windowsill. The water instantly transformed into ice with beautiful crystalline patterns. "Look at those patterns," said Emma with fascination. "They're so refined and symmetrical. It's true art. But we need to be careful," Hagrid reminded them. "If it accidentally directs that breath at one of us." The creature, as though understanding his words, nodded its head and moved slightly further from the humans. It lay down by the ice and looked at them with intelligent eyes, showing it understood the need for caution. "Intelligent creature," said Theodore with respect. "It understands the danger and tries to protect us." "Now we need to solve practical questions," said Selena. "How to create constant cold conditions for it. Ice from the kitchen won't last long." Hagrid thoughtfully scratched his thick beard. "We could try cooling charms, but I don't know if I can maintain them constantly." "What if we make something more permanent?" suggested Theodore. "Some special room or corner where it's always cold?" "That's difficult," sighed Hagrid. "It requires powerful magic, and I'm not confident in my abilities in this area." "Perhaps we should ask the professors for help?" cautiously suggested Emma. "No," said Hagrid sharply, then softened his tone. "That is not now. Let's try ourselves first. If the teachers find out, they might decide to return it to wherever it came from, or hand it over to the ministry. And it may have escaped from cruel people," added Selena. "We can't risk its safety." Theodore suddenly jumped up. "What if we use the ice room in the castle dungeons, where they store food for winter? It's always cold there, even in summer." "But house elves and other people often go there," objected Emma. "The creature would be noticed within hours." "Then we need to make something here, in the hut," decided Hagrid. "Perhaps rebuild part of the room? Or make an additional space," suggested Selena. "Small, but with constant cold." The creature listened to their conversation, turning its head from one speaker to another, as though understanding every word. When they spoke of creating a special home for it, its eyes lit up with hope. "All right," said Hagrid decisively. "We'll try. Theodore, can you bring more ice and ask the house elves to keep this secret?" "Of course. They're very discreet when it comes to helping." "Emma, can you look for spells to create permanent cold?" "I'm already thinking about it. There are several options in books on climatic magic." "And I'll help with construction," said Selena. "I have experience with repair charms." The creature suddenly rose and approached Hagrid. It carefully touched his hand with its cold nose. The touch was unpleasantly cold, but Hagrid didn't pull his hand away. The being looked at him with such gratitude that tears welled up in the large man's eyes. "Don't thank me yet," he whispered. "We're only beginning, but I promise, we'll do everything possible to make you feel at home here." The creature purred quietly and returned to its ice. But now there was not only weakness in its movements, but also some new energy. The energy of hope and trust in these kind people who were ready to fight for its happiness. "You know what," said Emma, closing the book. "Whilst we're planning a long-term solution, let's try a few simple cooling charms. At least it will give our friend more comfort." She drew her wand and carefully pointed it at a corner of the room, away from the fireplace. "Frigus permanentis." A visible cloud of cold air immediately appeared in the corner, whilst the temperature there noticeably decreased. The creature looked with interest in that direction, then slowly approached and stretched out blissfully in the cold zone. "It works!" exclaimed Theodore joyfully. "Look how it likes it." "But this is a temporary solution," warned Emma. "The spell will last a few hours at most. Then we'll renew it in turns," suggested Selena, "until we find something more reliable." The creature curled up in the cold corner, and for the first time looked truly relaxed and happy. Its breathing became even and calm, whilst the blue-silver scales shone with bright, healthy light. "Look at it," said Hagrid quietly. "Finally looks like a real living being, not a dying creature." Suddenly the frost salamander raised its head and released another stream of cold breath. But this time not for demonstration, but playfully. It directed it at the remains of water in Theodore's bowl, transforming it into a beautiful ice flower with delicate petals. "It's playing," laughed Selena. "Creating ice sculptures." "That's a good sign," smiled Hagrid. "When magical creatures start playing, it means they feel safe." Theodore carefully took the ice sculpture and turned it in the light. The crystals shimmered with all shades of blue, creating an incredibly beautiful play of light. "This is art," he whispered with reverence. "True art." The creature looked satisfied by the human's delight. It released another stream of cold breath, this time transforming water drops dripping from the window frame into ice. A whole garland of ice beads formed. Incredible, said Emma with fascination. It doesn't simply freeze things, it creates beauty. But suddenly the creature became too carried away with its game. It released a particularly powerful stream of cold air, directing it at the wall of the hut. The wooden boards instantly covered with a thick layer of frost, whilst part of the wall froze so severely it began to crack. "Oh dear," exclaimed Hagrid, looking at the damaged wall. "Seems it hasn't learned to control its strength yet." The creature immediately understood it had done something wrong. It pressed itself to the floor and whined guiltily, looking at the damage it had caused. "Nothing terrible, little one," Hagrid soothed it. "This can be fixed. You didn't do it on purpose. This is normal for young magical creatures," added Emma, looking at the book again. "It says here that young frost salamanders often cannot control the strength of their breath, especially when they're excited or happy. So we'll need to account for this when creating its permanent home," noted Selena. "The walls need to be stronger." Theodore approached the frozen wall and carefully touched it. "The ice is very thick and strong. If this were stone instead of wood." "An idea," suddenly exclaimed Selena. "What if we build not a room in the hut for it, but a separate small house, with stone walls that won't crack from cold?" "That's difficult," mused Hagrid, "but possible, if we all work together." "Meanwhile," said Theodore, drawing his wand, "let's fix the wall." Reparo. The wall gradually thawed, and the cracks disappeared. But traces of moisture remained, and some boards looked slightly warped. "It'll hold temporarily," assessed Hagrid. "But Selena's right, we need something more reliable." The creature still looked guilty, so Emma sat beside it and said gently, "Don't worry. We understand you're still learning. All youngsters sometimes make mistakes." The being looked at her with its blue eyes, full of gratitude, then carefully, very weakly released a thin stream of cold air, so weak it only slightly cooled the air around Emma's face. "Look," said the girl. "It's learning to control its strength. That was such a gentle breath." "Intelligent creature," said Hagrid with pride, "and learns quickly." They spent the rest of the day experimenting with different ways of maintaining cold and planning the future home for the frost salamander. Emma found several useful spells in books. Theodore continued bringing ice and cold items from the kitchen, while Selena worked on plans for the future construction. The creature gradually grew accustomed to its new friends. It learned to control the strength of its breath, at least partially, and even began playing little games, creating beautiful ice figures for the humans' entertainment. When evening came, the frost salamander curled up in its cold corner and fell asleep, purring softly in its dreams. Its breathing created a barely perceptible aura of cold around it, whilst thin patterns of frost formed on the floor. "It seems to feel at home," said Selena quietly, watching the peacefully sleeping being. "For now," nodded Hagrid. "But tomorrow we need to start building something more reliable. It can't live on the hut floor forever." "We'll manage," said Emma confidently. "We have a plan, we have knowledge, and most importantly, we have the desire to help." "As long as nobody finds out prematurely," muttered Theodore. "I fear the adults might not understand our intentions." But for now their secret was safe, whilst the frost salamander slept peacefully, having finally found a place where it was not only accepted, but where people were ready to fight for its happiness and safety. Tomorrow would bring them new challenges, construction, spells, and perhaps the first real tests of their friendship with the unusual guest. The following morning began peacefully. The frost salamander awoke in its cold corner looking considerably better. Its blue-silver scales shone with healthy luster, whilst its eyes were clear and lively. It playfully released several weak streams of cold air, creating beautiful patterns of frost on the floor that resembled flowers and stars. Hagrid was preparing its breakfast from crushed ice mixed with melted water, a mixture that, according to Emma's book, was perfect food for young frost salamanders. The creature consumed its unusual breakfast with appetite, occasionally purring with satisfaction. "Look how well it's eating," said Theodore cheerfully, who had arrived early in the morning with a fresh portion of ice and some tools for the future construction. "Yesterday morning it was so weak, and now it looks like a real living being." "That's because it's finally getting what it needs," explained Emma, who had spread new books on architecture and climatic charms across the table. "I've studied several more spells for permanent cooling. I think we'll be able to create a truly comfortable environment." Selena was examining the sketches she had drawn the previous evening. "I think it would be best to build a small pavilion right by the lake. It's naturally cooler there, and the proximity to water will help maintain humidity." The creature raised its head from its breakfast and looked at them with interest, as though understanding that plans for its future home were being discussed. It approached the table and carefully sniffed the drawings, leaving several ice droplets on the paper. "It likes the idea," laughed Selena. "Look," it nodded approvingly. Indeed, the salamander gently nodded its head, then playfully released a thin stream of cold air onto one of the drawings, decorating it with a delicate pattern of frost. "An artist," commented Hagrid with delight. "It's decorating our plans." They spent the morning discussing details of the future construction. Emma spoke about spells that could maintain constant low temperature. Theodore proposed practical solutions for the structure, while Selena thought through aesthetic aspects to ensure the salamander's new home would harmoniously fit into the landscape around Hogwarts. The creature meanwhile explored the hut, carefully sniffing various objects and leaving thin trails of frost behind. It showed particular interest in metal objects, the kettle, spoons, candlesticks, which under the influence of its breath covered with beautiful crystalline patterns. "It seems to like metal surfaces," noted Emma. "Perhaps we should add several metal elements to its future home." "Wonderful idea," agreed Hagrid. "We could make metal panels or decorative elements that it could decorate with its breath." Just as their plans were taking ever more concrete forms, someone knocked at the hut door. But this time the knock was completely different, commanding, impatient, demanding immediate response. Hagrid and the students exchanged anxious glances. The creature immediately sensed the tension in the air and hastily hid under the table, instinctively trying to become less noticeable. "Are you expecting anyone?" whispered Selena. "No," whispered Hagrid, rising to his feet. "And the knock doesn't sound like a student's or teacher's." He approached the door and carefully opened it, trying to block the view of the hut with his large body. On the threshold stood a man of medium height in an expensive dark blue cloak with silver clasps. His hair was neatly combed back and gleamed with pomade. His face was cleanly shaven, whilst a disdainful smile played on his thin lips. In his hand he held a beautiful wand with a carved handle, and around his neck hung a gold chain with some medallion. "Rubius Hagrid, I presume?" said the stranger in a voice that combined ostentatious politeness with barely concealed superiority. "Allow me to introduce myself, Reginald Christopher Winterbourne, expert in rare magical creatures and collector. May I come in?" Hagrid didn't move from his position, blocking the entrance. "And what's this regarding, Mr. Winterbourne?" "Oh, quite a small matter," replied the man, his smile becoming even more saccharine. "I'm looking for something that belongs to me. Very valuable, let's say, property, that might accidentally have ended up in these parts." "I don't understand what you mean," said Hagrid, trying to speak as calmly as possible. Winterbourne slightly tilted his head, as though listening. "Curious. And I heard that yesterday evening unusual temperature anomalies were observed in this part of the castle. Very specific anomalies that might be connected with the presence of a certain Arctic guest." The hut became even colder. The creature, though hidden, was clearly nervous and couldn't fully control its aura. "Aha!" said Winterbourne with satisfaction. "Exactly what I thought. Now please step aside, Mr. Hagrid. I have full right to retrieve my property." "Your property?" asked Hagrid indignantly. "And where are the documents proving this?" Winterbourne drew from his pocket a roll of papers with official seals. "Permit for collecting rare species from the Ministry of Magic, license for transporting magical creatures, and certificate of ownership of one frost salamander, purchased at a legal auction in Norway 3 months ago." Hagrid took the papers and quickly looked through them. The documents appeared genuine and bore all necessary seals and signatures. "You see," continued Winterbourne with false concern in his voice, "the poor creature escaped the day before yesterday evening during transportation. I'm very worried about its safety. Frost salamanders are such delicate creatures, they might die without proper care." "And how did it escape?" asked Hagrid suspiciously. Winterbourne's face darkened for a moment, but he quickly restored his smile. "An unfortunate accident. The magical cage was damaged during the storm. Those strange lightning flashes the day before yesterday. But now everything's fine. I can provide it with the best care." From inside the hut came a quiet but clear sound. The creature whined, and in this sound could be felt not only fear, but something resembling protest or even indignation. "You hear," said Winterbourne. "My little beauty has recognized my voice. It's rejoicing at meeting its master." But Hagrid heard differently. In the creature's whine was fear, pure primal fear, and this told him something was wrong here. "May I see the conditions in which you kept it?" asked Hagrid. "What?" said Winterbourne, surprised. "Well, if you're such a caring owner, surely you wouldn't mind showing how exactly you cared for it." What conditions you created, what you fed it. Winterborn hesitated for a moment. This is irrelevant. The main thing now is to return the creature to a safe place. And where did it live with you? Persisted Hagrid. In a specially equipped room with controlled climate, quickly replied the collector. And what did you feed it? Ice, of course. And fish. Frozen fish. Hagrid nodded, but his suspicions only intensified. From Emma's book he knew that frost salamanders ate fish only in natural conditions, whilst in captivity they preferred pure ice and snow. I see, he said. And how often did it use its ability to freeze things? Winterborn hesitated again. Ability to freeze? Well, it sometimes froze water in its bowl. Now Hagrid was certain. This man was lying. Anyone who had truly cared for a frost salamander would know about its powerful ability to emit streams of cold air. Mr. Winterborn, said Hagrid firmly, I'm afraid I can't simply hand over the creature. I need to be convinced that you're truly its lawful owner and that it will be safe. The collector's face changed, the smile vanished, whilst a cold glint appeared in his eyes. Hagrid, you're obstructing a ministry representative in performing lawful duties. This could have serious consequences for your position. Perhaps, replied Hagrid steadily. But first I need to speak with Professor McGonagall. Professor McGonagall? Winterborn looked worried. Yes, she's head of our house and has the right to know about everything that happens with magical creatures on school grounds. At that very moment a sound of falling came from inside the hut. One of the students had probably accidentally knocked something over, trying to move quietly. Winterborn immediately became alert. And who else is there? Students, answered Hagrid honestly. They're helping me care for the creature. Students, the collector's voice became sharp. You allowed children to contact a potentially dangerous creature? It's not dangerous, objected Hagrid. At least not to those who know how to handle it. But you don't know, exclaimed Winterborn, losing his composure. Frost salamanders can freeze a person solid with one breath. They're unpredictable and aggressive. Now Hagrid was finally convinced something was wrong. The creature he knew was gentle and careful. It had even learned to control the strength of its breath so as not to harm humans. Perhaps you'd better come in and look at it, suggested Hagrid. Make sure it's all right. Winterborn hesitated, but then nodded. Very well, but I warn you, if the creature has suffered any harm. Hagrid opened the door wider, allowing the collector to enter. Inside the hut reigned tense atmosphere. Emma, Theodore, and Selena sat by the table, trying to look busy with their books, but their tension was obvious. Winterborn quickly surveyed the room until his gaze stopped at the cold corner where the salamander was hiding. The creature pressed itself to the floor and trembled, not from cold, but from fear. Ah, there you are, my dear, said the collector sickeningly sweetly, approaching it. So much trouble because of you. The salamander retreated further into the corner, whilst around it formed a dense cloud of cold air, a defensive reaction to threat. Look, Winterborn addressed Hagrid. It's nervous because of the unusual surroundings. I need to take it immediately. But the students noticed what Winterborn was trying to hide. When he approached the creature, it wasn't simply nervous. It felt genuine terror. Its eyes were wide with fear, whilst its body trembled more and more. It's afraid of you, said Selena quietly but decisively. What? Winterborn turned to her. I said it's afraid of you. Look at its behavior. This isn't nervousness, this is terror. Nonsense, dismissed the collector. It's simply tired and wants to go home. But Emma had also noticed something important. Why did you say it was unpredictable and aggressive? All the books say frost salamanders are very peaceful creatures. Winterborn hesitated. Well, in captivity they can behave differently. And you also said you fed it fish, added Theodore. But young salamanders don't eat fish. They need only pure ice. The collector's face reddened. You don't understand the specifics of care. Then explain, interrupted Emma. Tell us in detail how you cared for it. What temperature did you maintain? How much ice did you give per day? How often did it use its ability to freeze air? I'm not obliged to report to children, exploded Winterborn. At that very moment the creature did something unexpected. It slowly emerged from its corner and approached Hagrid, pressing against his leg. Then it looked at Winterborn and whined quietly but clearly. The sound was filled not with fear, but with some decisive protest. It doesn't want to go with you, said Hagrid, looking at the creature with understanding. It doesn't matter what it wants, shouted Winterborn, losing the last remnants of self-control. It's my property. Property? Repeated Selena indignantly. This is a living being, not a thing. For the law it is exactly a thing, replied the collector coldly. And I have full right. He didn't manage to finish the phrase. The salamander suddenly released a powerful stream of cold air directly towards him. Winterbourne barely managed to dodge, but the edge of his cloak instantly covered with thick ice. You see, he exclaimed in panic. It's aggressive, dangerous, but Hagrid saw differently. The creature wasn't trying to cause harm. It was simply expressing its disagreement in the only way available to it, and the strength of the stream was carefully controlled, sufficient for demonstration, but not for real danger. It's defending itself, he said firmly, and I won't allow you to take it against its will. You have no right, screamed Winterbourne. I'll call the Aurors. Call them, replied Hagrid calmly. But first I'd like to learn the truth about how you really kept it. At that very critical moment, a figure appeared in the doorway, wearing green robes with a high collar. Professor McGonagall entered the hut, her stern gaze instantly assessing the situation. What is happening here? She asked in her most authoritative tone. Winterbourne immediately changed tactics, donning his mask of politeness again. Professor McGonagall, I presume? Reginald Winterbourne, expert in magical creatures. I've come for my property, but Mr. Hagrid refuses to cooperate. McGonagall looked at him, then at Hagrid, at the students, and finally her gaze stopped at the frost salamander, which still pressed against Hagrid's leg. A frost salamander, she said with surprise. An extraordinarily rare creature. How did it come to be here? It's mine, said Winterbourne quickly, extending the documents. Here are all the necessary permits. McGonagall took the papers and studied them carefully. Her face expressed no emotion as she read. The documents appear genuine, she finally said. But I'm interested in one detail. Which? Asked Winterbourne warily. According to this certificate, the creature was purchased as a specimen for scientific research. But your business card says you're a collector. These are rather different things. Winterbourne hesitated again. Well, collecting can include scientific aspects. Perhaps, replied McGonagall dryly. But according to international agreements on protection of rare magical species, any creature purchased for scientific purposes must be kept in conditions maximally approximating natural ones. Can you describe the conditions you created for the salamander? This question Winterbourne clearly hadn't expected. It lived in a special room. What size? Sufficient. What was the temperature? Cold. How cold? Specifically. Winterbourne began to sweat, despite the cold in the hut. I can't recall the exact figures. McGonagall raised an eyebrow. You can't recall the temperature regime for a creature that might die from overheating? That's somewhat strange for an expert. Listen, said the collector sharply. I'm not obliged to undergo interrogation. I need my property, and I have legal right to take it. Perhaps, nodded McGonagall. But now the creature is on Hogwarts grounds, and that means it's under my jurisdiction. And I have the right to ensure its return will be safe. She crouched beside the salamander, which carefully sniffed her hand, then trustingly touched it with its nose. Interesting, said McGonagall. It's not aggressive at all. On the contrary, it seems very peaceful and trusting. It can be unpredictable, said Winterbourne quickly. Really? McGonagall looked at the students. And what have you observed? It's very gentle, said Emma boldly, and intelligent. It learned to control the strength of its breath, so as not to harm us. And it's afraid of him, added Selena, pointing at Winterbourne. Very afraid. McGonagall nodded thoughtfully. Mr. Winterbourne, I'm afraid I'll need to conduct additional investigation before allowing you to take the creature. Investigation? Exclaimed the collector indignantly. On what grounds? On the grounds that the salamander's behavior indicates possible cruel treatment. And that's a violation of international agreements on magical fauna protection. Winterbourne paled. This is absurd. I cared for it perfectly. Then you have nothing to fear from investigation, replied McGonagall calmly. For now, the creature remains here, under Mr. Hagrid's supervision. You have no right, screamed Winterbourne. I do, and if you disagree, you may file a complaint with the ministry. And now I ask you to leave school grounds. The collector stood for several minutes, reddening with rage, then sharply turned and left the hut, slamming the door loudly. When his footsteps faded, the salamander finally relaxed. It released a quiet sigh of relief and pressed against McGonagall's leg. Interesting situation, said the professor, gently stroking the creature. Hagrid, I need the complete story of how this being came to be here. And Hagrid began to tell, about the lightning, about the discovery by his door, about the students' help, and about all their attempts to provide the salamander with a dignified life. McGonagall listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "I see," she said finally. "It seems you all made the right choice. But now we need to decide what to do next." The salamander looked at her with its blue eyes, filled with hope. In them could be read a simple request, to be allowed to remain with those who truly loved and cared for it. "May we keep it?" asked Hagrid quietly. McGonagall pondered. "That's a complex question. We need to conduct an official investigation, clarify all circumstances." And meanwhile, she looked at the salamander, then at the students, who gazed at her hopefully. Meanwhile, the creature indeed needs proper care, and it seems it has found people ready to look after it. Hope shone in everyone's eyes. Perhaps their fight for the little frost salamander's happiness was only beginning, but the first important battle had been won. The unwelcome guest had gone, whilst the true friends remained. The week following Winterbourne's visit passed in tense anticipation. The frost salamander remained in Hagrid's hut under constant supervision from the students, who took turns caring for it and maintaining the necessary temperature with cooling charms. The creature gradually grew accustomed to its rescuers, and even began to display playful characteristics, creating ever more complex and beautiful ice sculptures for its friends' amusement. Professor McGonagall wasted no time. She conducted a thorough investigation into Winterbourne's case, contacting Norwegian colleagues and international organizations for the protection of magical creatures. The results were both astounding and outrageous. This morning she came to Hagrid's hut with official documents in her hands and an expression of satisfaction on her usually stern face. Emma, Theodore, and Selena sat on the floor around the salamander, which had just finished creating a complex ice composition resembling a miniature castle with delicate towers and lace-like bridges. "Impressive work," said McGonagall, examining the crystal sculpture. "True artistry." The salamander rose and approached the professor, gently touching her hand with its cold nose. During this week it had learned to recognize people who helped it, and always greeted them with particular warmth, as much as was possible for a being with sub-zero body temperature. "I have wonderful news for you," began McGonagall, sitting on the chair Hagrid offered. "The investigation is complete, and the results exceeded my boldest expectations." Everyone waited tensely for her to continue. Firstly, McGonagall unfolded one of the documents. It transpired that Mr. Winterbourne was not the lawful owner of the salamander. A genuine auction in Norway did indeed take place, but the creature was bought by the renowned Arctic magic researcher Professor Einar Frostgard for a scientific institute in Reykjavik. "What happened to Professor Frostgard?" asked Emma with concern. "Here begins the most interesting part." McGonagall turned the page. "Winterbourne stole the salamander during transportation, forging the documents. Professor Frostgard contacted the ministries of magic of several countries with a report of theft, but so far had been unable to trace it." "So the creature was stolen," said Theodore indignantly. "Yes, but that's not all," continued the professor. "We discovered the conditions in which Winterbourne kept the salamander. It was locked in a cramped metal cage measuring 2 by 2 meters, without possibility of movement. The temperature was maintained too high, around 0 degrees, which for a frost salamander is equivalent to hell." Hagrid clenched his fists with anger. Cruel torture? Moreover, McGonagall looked at the salamander with compassion. It was used as a living freezer for preserving other specimens in his collection, forced to constantly freeze objects without being given rest. The salamander, as though understanding the conversation, whined quietly and pressed against Selena's legs. The girl carefully placed her hand on its head, despite the cold. "Now regarding the future," said McGonagall, her voice becoming softer. "Professor Frostgard is very grateful for the salamander's rescue. He's ready to pay all expenses for its maintenance, and even offered to take it to his institute." Everyone's heart stopped. The salamander raised its head and looked at McGonagall with anxiety in its blue eyes. "However," continued the professor with a slight smile, "when I told him about the conditions you created for it here, and about its obvious attachment to you, he proposed an alternative." "What?" asked Hagrid impatiently. "Professor Frostgard is ready to officially transfer the salamander into Hogwarts care as part of the educational program for magical creature care, provided that it's ensured proper living conditions." Joy and relief illuminated everyone's faces. The salamander, as though understanding that something good was being discussed, purred quietly and released several small streams of cold air, decorating the air around itself with sparkling crystals. "This means it can stay?" asked Selena hopefully. "Yes, if we can create appropriate conditions for it," nodded McGonagall. "And here I have another piece of news. Headmaster Dumbledore has approved the project to create a special environment for the salamander. It's called Frost Haven, Haven of Frost." Emma's eyes lit up. "Frost Haven, how beautifully it sounds." "The project will be implemented through joint efforts of several professors," explained McGonagall. "Professor Flitwick will provide the magical aspects of climate control. Professor Snape will prepare special potions for maintaining low temperatures, whilst I shall handle landscape transfiguration." "Where will this be located?" asked Theodore. "By the lake, as you planned. An area approximately 30 by 20 meters, surrounded by invisible barriers that will maintain temperatures from -10 to +5 degrees Celsius year-round." Hagrid wiped his eyes with his sleeve. This is more than we could have dreamed. "But the best is yet to come," smiled McGonagall. "Frost Haven will be open for visits by all students. It will become a unique educational space where pupils can observe a rare magical creature in its natural environment." The salamander looked increasingly excited, as though understanding that something very important for its future was being discussed. It approached each of its rescuers and carefully touched them, making quiet sounds of gratitude. "When will all this be ready?" asked Hagrid. "The professors have already begun work. By my calculations, in a week Frost Haven will be completely ready for habitation." The following week passed in a whirl of activity. By the lake grew a true marvel of architecture and magic, a patch of land where eternal winter reigned. A thin layer of snow covered the grass. Small icicles hung from specially grown evergreen plants, whilst in the center of the composition was created a small pond with crystal-clear water that never froze thanks to special charms, but remained sufficiently cold for the salamander's comfort. Professor Flitwick installed a system of climate charms that automatically regulated temperature and humidity. Professor Snape developed special potions that dispersed in the air and maintained the ideal atmospheric composition. And Professor McGonagall created beautiful ice caves and grottos where the salamander could hide and rest. Around the perimeter of Frost Haven were installed comfortable benches with soft cushions and warming charms, so students could comfortably observe the salamander without suffering from cold. Information plaques told about the peculiarities of frost salamanders and rules for safe observation. Finally came moving day. The salamander walked from Hagrid's hut to its new home accompanied by everyone who had helped it during these unforgettable weeks. It seemed to understand the importance of the moment and walked with particular dignity. The moment it stepped onto Frost Haven's territory, true magic occurred. The salamander breathed deeply of the cold air. Its eyes shone with happiness, whilst the blue-silver scales played with all shades of winter sunlight. It ran across the entire territory, exploring every corner, then approached the pond and with pleasure immersed its paws in the cool water. "It likes it," whispered Selena with enchantment. The salamander suddenly raised its head and released a mighty stream of cold air upwards. It formed a beautiful cloud of ice crystals in the air that slowly descended like real snow. This was its gratitude, the most beautiful and sincere imaginable. "Incredible," whispered Professor Flitwick, who had come to see the result of their work. "It's transformed our project into true art." During the following days, Frost Haven became one of the most popular places in Hogwarts. Students of all years and houses came to see the frost salamander. It proved to be a true artist, creating incredible ice sculptures, demonstrating its freezing abilities, and even seeming to pose for those who wanted to draw or photograph it. It particularly loved hot days, when students came to cool themselves by its pond. The salamander playfully cooled the air around them, and sometimes even created small ice figures for amusement. Madame Pomfrey quickly appreciated the practical benefit from the salamander. The cold air it released was ideal for treating burns and reducing inflammation, and the castle's cooks began requesting help with preserving food. The salamander gladly froze whatever needed to be kept for long periods. Professor Snape, though not admitting it openly, also found use for the new castle resident. Some potions required precisely controlled cooling, and the salamander's breath provided ideal conditions for such experiments. Emma, Theodore, and Selena became official assistant keepers of Frost Haven. They helped Hagrid with daily care of the salamander, conducted tours for younger students, and even began keeping an observation diary of the frost salamander's behavior. "Look," said Emma one summer evening, as they sat on benches around Frost Haven, "it's learned to understand our names." Indeed, when any of the friends called the salamander by name, they had named it Crystal. It immediately raised its head and ran to whoever was calling. "Crystal," called Theodore gently, and the salamander approached him, playfully releasing a stream of cold air onto his palms, creating a miniature snowflake. "It's not just an animal," said Hagrid with pride. "It's a member of our family." And Crystal, as though understanding his words, approached Hagrid and pressed against his leg, purring quietly in its icy language. When winter arrived, Frost Haven merged with the natural winter landscape, becoming even more beautiful. Crystal was in its element. It ran playfully through real snow, bathed in natural icicles, and even befriended several polar owls that had come to winter at Hogwarts. Students came to Frost Haven even on the coldest days, to warm themselves by magical fires installed around the perimeter and watch Happy Crystal in its natural element. One spring day, exactly a year after the salamander had first appeared by Hagrid's hut, a letter arrived from Professor Frostguard. He wrote that he would like to visit Hogwarts and see how the salamander was faring under their care. Professor Frostguard proved to be a tall, thin man with icy whiteness in his hair and kind blue eyes. When he saw Frost Haven and the happy, healthy Crystal, his eyes filled with tears of joy. "This is incredible," he told Hagrid and the professors. "I've worked with frost salamanders for over 20 years, but have never seen one so happy and healthy. You've created a true paradise for it." Crystal approached Professor Frostguard and carefully sniffed him. Then it did something unexpected. It created a beautiful ice sculpture in the shape of a heart for him, as though thanking him for allowing it to remain at Hogwarts. "I officially transfer guardianship of it to you," said Professor Frostguard solemnly. "Crystal has found a true home, and I have no right to take it away." That evening a small ceremony took place in Frost Haven. Headmaster Dumbledore personally came to congratulate Crystal on its official acceptance into the Hogwarts community. Professors, students, and everyone who had helped create the wonderful haven gathered around the pond. "Crystal," said Dumbledore in his warm voice, "you remind us that true magic lies not in spells and potions, but in kindness, understanding, and readiness to help those who need it." The salamander looked at all its friends, and suddenly did something incredible. It released one powerful stream of cold air straight upwards, and it opened in the sky, forming an enormous snowflake with thousands of icy rays. The snowflake slowly turned in the air, scattering millions of tiny crystals around that fell on the gathering like a blessing from winter skies. "Amazing," whispered Dumbledore. "I think that's its way of saying thank you. When the celebration ended and everyone had dispersed, Hagrid, Emma, Theodore, and Selena remained in Frost Haven with Crystal. She curled up by the pond, looking absolutely happy and content. "You know," said Hagrid quietly, "when I first found her, I thought I was saving her life. But now I understand she saved us." "How so?" asked Emma. "She showed us that true happiness comes when you help someone else find their home," replied Hagrid, "and that the best friends are those who accept you as you are, even if you're completely unlike them." Crystal raised her head and looked at them, as though understanding every word. Then she purred quietly, a sound that had become a favorite lullaby for all who knew and loved the little frost salamander from Frost Haven. Stars began to appear in the sky, reflecting in the ice crystals around the pond. Frost Haven glowed with soft blue light, creating a fairy tale atmosphere. And Crystal, having finally found a true home where she was loved and valued, slept peacefully, knowing that tomorrow would bring new adventures with her best friends. The Frost Salamander's story became a Hogwarts legend, a story about how kindness, understanding, and readiness to fight for truth can transform a life. And every time new students came to Frost Haven and saw Happy Crystal, they learned not simply about a rare magical creature, but about the true magic of friendship and love. Frost Haven became a place where everyone could find peace and inspiration, where winter always combined with the warmth of human hearts, whilst the little frost salamander reminded everyone that home is not a place, but the people who love you.